That is why they've chosen to liquidate hundreds of billions of dollars they've invested in the mythological figure of bin Laden. They wouldn't be doing that if it weren't something big. It goes far beyond Obama's fortunes at the polls. It's an attempt to try to save the U.S. position in the world.
Involvement in the internal affairs of sovereign countries often consists in co-opting members of opposition parties, financing them through the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, various private foundations, essentially with a view to implementing regime change. In other words, installing politicians who are chosen and who are there to replace an existing political system. And that is what we call a client regime. And there are many U.S. client regimes around the world. Okay, we don't even need to mention names. We have client regimes in the former Soviet Union. In Georgia is a good case of a client regime. And we see how the United States, through its foundations, manages also to influence the course of politics in Georgia, specifically for serving U.S. strategic objectives in that region. The support to members of opposition parties in Russia should come as no surprise. The Russian government is a government which states its points of view. If the United States doesn't like these point of view, or if they consider that Russia is not on the right wavelength, they will attempt to weaken or destabilize the government, the existing government, and contemplate the possibility of a regime change, as they have in numerous countries around the world. There are countries which have their own independent governments, which don't take orders from Washington, in Latin America, in the Middle East. And these countries, if they do not abide by US demands, the United States will attempt a regime change. And how do they undertake a regime change? They establish links with opposition political parties. They may be involved in covert operations through the intelligence apparatus, and of course these opposition groups are often financed directly by U.S. foundations. This is part of a modus operandi. It's really the ABC of U.S. foreign policy. I think it's very important that this issue be discussed and debated, and it's certainly very important that it's now being debated in Russia, because from our standpoint, this kind of diplomacy by the United States is unacceptable. That the United States would finance either directly from the State Department or through various front organizations such as the National Endowment for Democracy should support local groups to serve U.S. interests domestically. The National Endowment for Democracy is really an outgrowth of the CIA, and you can look at its profile. It has, in fact, one of the former directors of the National Endowment for Democracy said, "We are doing legally what the CIA used to do." Okay, and you look at their mandate. Well, their mandate is to support U.S.-style democratization throughout the world. Now, U.S.-style democratization, we know what it is. We know what it is. It's the antithesis of democracy. How can a country which is involved in targeted assassinations, torture, the whole process of financing and manipulating elections, present itself as a role model
The European Union is concerned about the situation in Russia because of certain restrictions on democratic liberties, such as free press. Do you understand the EU's concerns?
Понимаю, это давняя традиция европейских стран. Навязывать свои стандарты и правила.
I understand them. That's a long-standing tradition of European countries. They impose their standards and rules on others. Remember what happened during the colonization period, say in Africa. I get the impression that this old tradition has transformed into democratization. Europeans and our Western partners in general like to use this method whenever they want to get a tighter grip on a certain region. As for violations, they happen everywhere. Let's take, for example, human rights violations in the French penitentiary system, in French prisons. Yes, there are violations, and we should fight against them. In fact, I think even in the Russian political system, there are certain things that need to be adjusted or corrected or enhanced. But that's a natural process by which our society becomes mature. Look at our past. Initially we had the Tsar, then Stalin, and then the communist regime. It wasn't until the early 1990s that we started building a society based on different principles. It takes time.
Do you think the democratic model, the Western model, is not very good for Russia at this point?
А вы можете мне сказать, что такое западная модель демократии?
Can you explain to me what you mean by the Western democratic model? There's one model in France and a different model in the US. At some point in the past, I had a lot of discussions with my American colleagues. I would ask them, how come the majority of your people voted for one person, yet another person becomes president? That's because they have the Electoral College. My American colleagues replied to me, don't touch this thing. We've got used to this system and we won't change it. So we don't lecture them. Well, what makes you think you can lecture us? We can decide for ourselves what we should do.
Now, the US and its Arab allies are quietly pursuing a missile defense system across the Persian Gulf. American officials say the project is aimed at repelling a possible attack from Iran. Washington has boosted sales of detection systems and missile batteries to countries like Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. This map right here shows how the Iranian state is being increasingly encircled by all kinds of US military bases and weapons. Soraya Sepapur-Ulrich, an independent researcher and writer, believes a hypothetical threat from Tehran is a pretext for further expansion in a key strategic area.
America believes in realigning its forces to better control and dominate the world. And I think that perhaps, and it needs the cooperation of the countries involved. And I think that Iran being made into a threat has allowed the Arab countries to cooperate with America because really they rely on America for their internal securities, and which actually is an important point here because the internal securities of some of these countries are now in jeopardy. And with every base that America creates, with every missile defense shield or Patriot missile, everything that it exports to any given country, it has personnel going with it. So one has to question whether these are to calm down the potential threats that might arise in countries that have always supplied America with the oil it needed and the soldiers, or whether it's actually for a wider purpose.
Washington did join hands with those seeking to replace Gaddafi and take over power in Libya. To help prop them up, the U.S. pledged to funnel billions of dollars of Gaddafi's frozen assets to the Transitional Council.
I am currently drafting legislation at the request of the State Department and the administration that will authorize the transfer of available cash assets to the Council.
But the support from Washington comes not only in money and Tomahawk missiles, but also in military command. One of the commanders of the Libyan rebel army is General Khalifa Hifter, a longtime Gaddafi defector. He lived in a Washington suburb for the last 20 years, before he took off to Libya in March this year to command the rebel forces. Khalifa Hifter lived just minutes away from CIA headquarters, although any intelligence connections have never been officially confirmed.
At the moment we have CIA operatives all over eastern Cyrenaica, CIA agents who were there even before Obama recognized it and who have been pouring into eastern Libya, working alongside French intelligence and British SAS as well. They are manipulating the agenda of this transitional council.
Some analysts say the U.S. is using the turmoil in Libya to propel to power people who would be loyal to their interests.
Gaddafi, having been there for 40 years plus, had a will of his own. So he had a significant degree of independence and he had his own policies. You look at this collection of Jibril, Jalil, Yunus, and Hifter. These people are foreign agents. They're NATO stooges. They're completely controlled, and they will never be able to assert any kind of independent, autonomous Libya. The risks of the puppet regime are that this will degenerate into chaos. Right now, the rebels can only exist with complete NATO support.
A number of leaders who were propped up by Washington have faced popular discontent. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak had been extensively supported by the U.S. for decades, despite domestic disapproval of his policies. Yemen has seen violent protests over the rule of its president, who many believe has managed to hold on to power only thanks to U.S. support. And the government of Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan has been struggling with public discontent for years.
The U.S. and its allies will go in to establish some sort of a regime that we approve of, but the process is not going to be a democratic one, and in the long run, the odds are overwhelming that the Libyan people will reject that regime. The American policymakers who talk about this kind of thing are not themselves deluded. They know perfectly well what they're doing. They know it's not going to work in the long run, but they have other reasons for wanting to have short-term gains.
Having clearly taken sides in the Libyan civil war, Washington is now seeking to forge strong ties with whoever might come to power there. But analysts say such an overwhelming support, financial, military, and political, never comes without strings attached. I'm Ganesh Chekdown reporting from Washington, RT.
The head of Britain's armed forces insists that killing Colonel Gaddafi will be within the rules as NATO appears to ready itself for a long war. But investigative journalist Tony Gosselin says it's the alliance that should be brought to justice, not the Libyan leader.
This is a political decision. It should never be a military decision. I think the reason that the military chief has announced it is really to save the face of our politicians here in Britain, who are pushing this whole matter way beyond what was agreed at the United Nations Security Council. That is a serious problem, and this is why the Russians and others are now saying there must be a ceasefire. Why is it, we have to ask ourselves, that the British and NATO particularly, this is a NATO initiative now, have decided that they want to intervene so heavily in this civil war, rather than let the Libyan people decide for themselves the outcome of how they want the politics in their country to be in the future. This is, I would consider, a war crime under the present situation, and it goes way outside the present UN resolution. We don't see Colonel Gaddafi going into foreign countries, invading them, bombing them, attacking them. We don't see these long protracted wars carried out by Colonel Gaddafi. I think he's the least of our problems, and we should see Tony Blair and George Bush in the dock at the International Criminal Court.
Who gave coalition forces in Libya the right to eliminate Gaddafi? Well, that's the question Vladimir Putin's been asking during an official visit to Denmark. The Russian premier also said NATO's effectively joined one of the warring sides in the conflict, and more responsible action should be taken instead. RT's Daniel Bushell joins us now live for this in Brussels. Daniel, so the Russian Prime Minister has effectively lashed out on the operation there in Libya.
Yes, he's made the speech in Denmark, and he was very angry. He says that Gaddafi is not the best person in the world. Sure, he's made many mistakes, done many bad things, but that does not give the coalition the right to bomb indiscriminately. His words were that they are bombing Gaddafi's palaces in Tripoli every night. Now, coalition said that their plan was not to get rid of Gaddafi. So his question was, Mr. Putin's question was, why are the coalition forces obviously making this effort to go after Colonel Gaddafi himself? Now, we also heard that the experts here in Brussels have confirmed that there is bombing going on by the coalition forces, which is not being covered by the media here in the European Union. Mr. Putin added that oil was a key interest for the Western powers, for the European powers.